AI adds a major new imperative and urgency to the business and human rights discourse. And I think the UN guiding principles, more than ever, provide a valuable framework for working through what is the state duty to protect when it comes to AI and what is the corporate responsibility to respect, not only for the AI companies and hyperscalers themselves, but for every company that is using AI. And what is the access to remedy and what are the just transition implications of AI on jobs?
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from Jane Nelson, the director of the Corporate Responsibility Initiative at Harvard Kennedy Business School. Jane has spent 25 years working as a pioneer in the business and human rights space. She works closely with John Ruggie, who drafted the UNGPs, which are the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, almost 15 years ago. My colleague Salil Tripathi caught up with Jane to mark that anniversary and asked, are the UNGPs still relevant today? How deeply are human rights embedded into corporate thinking? And what does responsible business look like in 2026 and beyond? Salil's with you now. Salil, tell me about Jane. Why did you want to speak to her in particular about this?
Jane Nelson has a huge influence on the whole corporate responsibility movement. If you look at the history and go back to, say, 30, 35 years ago, when these issues started becoming important with the campaign against Shell in Nigeria and BP in Colombia. At that time, there were no UN guiding principles. There was not even a global compact. We are talking about that long ago. At that time, there was the organization called, what used to be called the Prince of Wales Business Leaders Forum, which later became the International Business Leaders Forum, operating out of London. And Jane was a senior executive there. And she worked very hard to try to get companies to do it right. And one of the ways they can do it right is by not doing anything that was wrong. So she was at that forefront of the movement. She was working closely with Amnesty International's UK section, and she was instrumental in putting together the team that wrote one of the first and seminally important papers of that time, which was called Human Rights, Is It Any of Your Business? And she spearheaded that process, which was written by Frances House, our former colleague, and Peter Frankenthal. So Jane has been very much part of that. So when the Global Compact happened, she was one of the first people that John Ruggie turned to have conversations about. And later, when she moved to Harvard to work at the Mosauer Center for Corporate Responsibility with John Ruggie, so the entire process of the formation of UNGPs, from the beginning, she was part of the conversation. She took part in many of the consultations. She was not the drafter of it. She was not one of the writers of the process, but she was a very close observer, a well-wisher, and a champion from then. So I thought that with the guiding principles turning 15 now, she was one of the very appropriate people to have a conversation with it about.
Tell me about how Jane has worked with business over the years.
She takes a constructive engagement approach. She works with companies, within companies. She's been on boards of some companies. She's been on advisory groups to companies. I've been with her on a couple of panels where we are both part of a panel of, say, 6 to 8 people working on sustainability or human rights or corporate governance. And we have conversations with those companies periodically. And I've had the privilege of being with her on that. And she's very good at cutting through the nonsense, and seeing the exact thing that needs to be done. And she understands how companies and their minds think. So the advice that she comes up with and recommendations she makes tend to be very practical.
Thank you, Salil. Let's hear your conversation now.
So the UN guiding principles are now 15 years old, and 15 years can be too little or too much, depending on the way you look at it. But given that we are where we are they still relevant? Do they matter? Or do we need something new?
The UN guiding principles are more relevant than they have ever been, in my mind, Salil, in a world of geopolitical uncertainty, economic fragmentation, growing inequality, the human impacts as well as the physical impacts of climate change, technological disruption. I think we need them more than ever. And I think the brilliance of the protect, respect, remedy framework and the state duty to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect, and the access to effective remedy for victims of human rights abuses is relevant in every industry sector, across all rights, across all countries, across all types of business. So I would argue they're more important than ever. I think also more important than ever is the polycentric, multi-fiduciary approach that John Ruggie and his team took, both in designing but also in operationalizing and implementing the UN Guiding Principles framework, where you have state duties, you have corporate responsibilities, but you also have the legal profession, you have standard setters and accounting firms, you have financial institutions, from development finance institutions to banks and investors and insurers and stock exchanges. You obviously have the critical role of civil society organizations, trade unions and labor movements, and other international governmental organizations. So I think they are absolutely centrally, critically important to the world that we're in. And I think they continue to be the perfect framework and implementation approach for getting companies, all companies across all sectors, to respect human rights.
No, I completely agree. I mean, because I've always seen the guiding principles as like what we in Britain call the highway code. It tells you what you should do. It may not prevent accidents, but not reading that book will definitely ensure that you will have accidents. But given that, and given where the companies are, how deeply embedded are the UNGPs today? That's one question. And the other is that, when John and his team presented and when the Human Rights Council adopted the principles unanimously 15 years ago, what you saw was that some criticism from NGOs that these were not binding principles. And there was a lot of criticism of that part of it. But at the same time, today, when I look at the same NGOs, they're citing them as though they were soft law or norms. So it was to that extent, that criticism is no longer valid. Knowing what you knew of John, because you worked closely with him, how much of it was a pragmatic compromise, or was it a genuine strategic choice to move in this direction?
I mean, I certainly see it as a genuine strategic choice, and but also principal pragmatism, that if one is going to aim to have a global treaty, it's going to take years and years to get that agreed. And
I mean, one thing I always remind people is that something as simple as torture, on which there cannot be two views, even that Convention Against Torture took almost 3 decades to get accepted at the UN level. So when something so simple takes such a complex path, something that's slightly more nuanced is going to take much longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it, from 2005 to 2011, a 6-year period, John and his team undertook massive research around the world, partnered with a range of different academic institutions and scholars, but also undertook over 50 consultations, with business, with civil society, with governments, with development finance institutions, with the legal profession. And so by the time the UNGPs were unanimously endorsed by the Human Rights Council, they were the first ever authoritative global standard. And that just would not have been possible to have reached that point by 2011 if it had gone through the normal sort of treaty negotiation process. So to me, I think the important part was and continues to be about the UN Guiding Principles is this multi-fiduciary, polycentric approach, and that it's not only relying on companies and companies' voluntary actions. There are all sorts of, obviously, regulatory instruments, pathways from a litigation perspective, international bar associations actively engaged. You've got accounting, reporting community actively engaged, and you have advocacy NGOs as well as other non-governmental organizations and civil society actively engaged, either pressurizing and or engaging with business on being rigorous in the way that companies are implementing the guiding principles. I'd love to chat a little bit more about how I see companies are continuing to implement them.
I was just coming to that, actually, because, you've been on corporate board, you've been an advisor to many companies, and you see it at the C-suite level about how this is playing out. So if you can just elaborate on that, about how ingrained and how embedded are these principles now in corporate thinking?
I sort of hesitate a little bit, Salil, because I'm very conscious I see and engage with a small fraction of the 60,000 plus or minus companies that are publicly quoted, let alone the millions that are either private and small and medium-sized enterprises. But certainly what I'm seeing with large global companies and pretty much across industry sectors, the ones that have made a public commitment to respecting human rights and either endorsing or supporting the guiding principles, I think have moved from policy statements and a general endorsement to actually using the guiding principles from both a strategy perspective, but also sort of a operations perspective. So due diligence, I think they are serious about due diligence, and that ranges from going through regular exercises on identifying what are the most salient human rights risks in their business, in their operations, in their supply chains. And then also when they're making decisions about projects, about M&A, about supply chain relationships, they are looking through, at least partly through a lens of risks to people as well as risks to the company. So I think the work on due diligence continues to encourage me. I think many of the companies, certainly that I'm aware of, have put in place not just a policy statement, but standards and a variety of standards around either different human rights or broadly or different people and groups at risk. They've got internal controls and oversight and accountability mechanisms, which, again, certainly many of the companies I'm familiar with are now at a board level in terms of overview and oversight. Clearly, there's been a lot of work on disclosure and reporting, and some of that now, as we know, is mandatory when it comes to human rights, and a lot of it remains voluntary. But I think that's a third important area. Fourth, I'm seeing companies much more thoughtful and systematic around not only identifying salient human rights risks and impacts, but also in the way they're engaging, whether it's workers, communities, consumers, affected groups, also with human rights defenders. And a number of companies I'm aware of have much more rigorous programs now around human rights defenders and supporting human rights defenders. I think fourth has been the growing focus of the nexus between human rights, climate, AI, inequality, equity issues, and companies taking a more strategic approach on that. And I would say two other areas that I see where companies are continuing to embed is that they're increasingly thinking around not simply this is a risk management sort of reactionary do no harm approach, but this is much more about being proactive in respecting human dignity, improving welfare, and realizing rights as opposed to just sort of reacting to and preventing rights abuses, although that obviously remains absolutely foundational. And then finally, I think companies are developing interesting coalitions, and particularly place-based coalitions, and recognizing that even if they have all these due diligence processes and stakeholder engagement and reporting in place and strategies in place, that they often need to work with other partners in their supply chains, obviously with government where they're able to, and civil society, to take a more systematic approach to respecting rights. So, yeah, I see a lot of companies taking all of those areas seriously, spending time, resources and thought from the board level down to operating sites, be they farms or factories or mines or manufacturing plants.
Yeah, I mean, and in all the years I've known you, Jane, I know that you're a bridge builder. I mean, you like alliances, you like people to talk to unlikely coalition partners and build coalitions and, coalition of willing, as it were. At the same time, there are campaigners who sometimes feel that constructive engagement has very little value because they feel that it's you talk to public affairs people and nothing ever happens. And at the same time, there are companies which are genuinely seeking partnerships. So even within companies, there are some people who want genuine partnerships with the civil society and some who think that this is unrealistic and a complete waste of time. So my question is a genuine partnership possible? Which are the sectors where you've seen it work? I've seen it work quite a bit actually in the extractive sector because a lot of large mining companies tend to hire anthropologists to do their social development studies, and more power to them. But other than that, I mean, I was just curious if you know of cases or instances or geographies where this is more feasible and possible.
First of all, I think genuine partnerships are absolutely possible, Salil, but they are and they should only be one part of that civil society and civic accountability ecosystem. So I think it's really important that you have your advocacy groups, campaigning groups. Some of them are very evidence-based and fact-based and thoughtful in the way they campaign. Others maybe less so, but I think evidence-based campaigning and advocacy groups play a very important role. I think you have another broad category of civil society organizations who will consult with companies or will convene rights defenders to engage with companies, but are not necessarily going to partner and cooperate with companies. And then you absolutely have human rights development and other civil society organizations who will have a strategic partnership with companies. And sometimes you have civil society organizations that are doing elements of all of those. And I think Oxfam has probably been an interesting example in the past. Think of that Beyond the Brands campaign with the food sector, which I think was very effective at the time of getting some of the major food brands to the table. They got financial institutions involved. So it was a very effective campaign, but a campaign that also led into convening and dialogue around not only human rights, but human rights was a core element of that. And in certain cases, they have partnered with companies to assess impacts and help companies measure impact. I think the civil society organization Resolve works effectively in that way. I would look at your Institute of Human Rights and Business, the way you have convened companies in certain industry sectors and encouraged and challenged them to implement the UN guiding principles and or take a more strategic industry-wide or place-based approach to respecting human rights. So I think there's a whole range of NGO tactics and strategies that are important. And it is that ecosystem that helps to either pressurize and confront companies, consult and convene companies, or cooperate with companies, that the major global companies that are serious about embedding respect for human rights in their policies and their strategies and their operations and supply chains recognize that they're going to be dealing with a whole range of those different types of NGOs, and I think are thoughtful in, responding to the advocacy NGOs, particularly when they're evidence-based and fact-based, but at the same time very open with consultation mechanisms, advisory engagement with civil society leaders, bringing in anthropologists, bringing in different skill sets as the companies themselves are doing their own risk and impact assessments, and then also more strategic partnerships. And I think you're right. The energy, sort of oil and gas, mining companies, and probably the food and beverage companies have been the most strategic in thinking about that civic ecosystem, civil society ecosystem. But I think most large multinational companies that have any commitment at all to respecting rights and addressing other social and environmental risks and opportunities realize that this range of civil society relationships is a critical part of the ecosystem that companies are operating in.
The one thing that John reminded us through the guiding principles was the state duty to protect. As a cornerstone of the guiding principles, then the corporate responsibility to respect follows from that. Now, at the same time, we are now seeing a significant rollback. I have in my mind companies lowering their commitment to ESG targets, at least in the United States, at least wiping out from their websites whatever they might do on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Even if they continue the programs, they don't want to publicize it. And human rights due diligence in general, people don't want to talk about it because there is what they call the green hushing movement is going on. Even the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive of the EU is also, to tone down from what it was being done earlier. Now, are we, as someone who works constructively with business and sees this scenario well, how do you read this moment? Are we in a genuine crisis, or are we at a time where we have to tide it over and things will get better again because this is what customers want, consumers want, communities want?
I'll start by saying, I think we are in a fundamental paradigm shift, and it's not only the current regulatory pullback, particularly in the US, but in the EU and in certain other countries. I think we have to look at this period as recognizing the geopolitical tensions, the economic fragmentation, the growing resource competition, growing sort of technology competition, as well as some of the regulatory pulling back and backlash. And at the same time, in this very complex, uncertain and often uneven and inconsistent period we're in. At the same time, the planetary boundaries are real, the impact and the human impacts of climate change are real, and I would argue accelerating. The impacts of AI and fundamental technological change, supply chain constraints, etc. So I think companies, in my view, are having to take not necessarily a step back, but absolutely sharpen focus and be very thoughtful and structured in what is most material from a double material perspective, what is also most salient in terms of the human rights risks that our activities create for people and the risks to our company and our business, and be very focused on those material or sort of salient risks and impacts. So I think you're seeing companies sharpen their focus. I think you're definitely seeing much less of those major global announcements, highly ambitious statements and commitments. And that sort of sense, and it's not just in the case of climate, but just transition, even living wages. If companies can't see a clearer pathway, I think they are definitely more reticent in terms of making ambitious statements. Having said that, the vast majority of the companies I know are actually continuing to adhere to the public commitments they have made on a range of topics, including a range of human rights risks and impacts. I think you're seeing less global coalitions than industry-wide coalitions, but I think we're seeing more place-based coalitions and value chain coalitions emerging. And fourthly, I think we are seeing a shift in the language, which to a certain extent is and will influence the strategy, much more around language of resilience, security. I mean, obviously, energy is a classic example where it's not only energy transition, but it's energy security and energy access. I think companies are being clearer, both publicly as well as internally, of some of the trade-offs that have to be made and the sometimes difficult internal conversations that have to be made. So I would argue it's a period of time that companies can see the long-term trends, they can see the challenges. They also do have to navigate the regulatory environments and the political environments in which they're operating. And so if anything, I think they're becoming more rigorous, more sophisticated, more thoughtful about what is most material and most salient to their business, to their supply chain, to their long-term resilience, including the human rights risks and impacts that result from their activities.
Yeah, I mean, you did allude to artificial intelligence in your response, and I was coming to that because, when John and his team were preparing the guiding principles, AI was still the pie in the sky. I mean, it wasn't there. People could imagine it, but it was a matter of science fiction rather than reality. And now it is very much part of our present. So to what extent are the guiding principles, as you see them, prescient? Because, one of the things whenever a UN declaration is written, one of the criticisms has been that whenever a document comes out, it addresses the problems of the present and the past and not the future. But like the Universal Declaration, I happen to believe that guiding principle does provide some kind of a pathway. So I just wanted to explore more what you thought about that.
Absolutely. And I very much agree with you on that, Salil. I think, again, it comes back to the brilliance of the the protect, respect, remedy framework, in that I would argue that state duty to protect and the corporate responsibility to respect and the access to remedy is more important than it's ever been. So I think that those fundamental principles and the thinking behind those principles are absolutely relevant today. And if anything, our AI adds a major new imperative and urgency to the business and human rights discourse. And I think the UN guiding principles, more than ever, provide a valuable framework for working through what is the state duty to protect when it comes to AI, and what is the corporate responsibility to respect, not only for the AI companies and hyperscalers themselves, but for every company that is using AI, and what is the access to remedy, and what are the just transition implications of AI on jobs. And so I think if we look at the AI value chain from supply, the growing focus on critical minerals, all the refining and manufacturing that goes into sort of AI-enabled economy. We look at AI infrastructure, the energy, water, land, community nexus there. And in fact, I was smiling over the weekend because I was going back and looking at the Institute's 16 years of your top 10 human rights issues every year. In 2010, 2 of your top 10 was addressing challenges relating to land acquisition and use and corporate use and management of water. And if we think of 2 of the biggest environmental challenges, but also human rights challenges of AI data centers and infrastructure, it's that land acquisition, water, and obviously energy. And so we're seeing many of the same human rights issues emerge that were and continue to remain critical to the energy and mining sector.
The French have a phrase, right? Plus ça change. Yeah.
Plus ça change. But I mean, all of it shows how just the enduring importance of and need to be vigilant around all of these human rights risks and impacts. But as you look at the supply chain of AI, you look at the infrastructure of AI, you look at the training of large language models and the biases, the exclusionary aspects of that. And then obviously you look at all the use cases, and clearly there are going to be many use cases that are potentially positive for human rights defenders and human rights, but many that are going to be very challenging, and not least the impact on jobs, but privacy, surveillance, social stability. But every step of the AI value chain, human rights risks and impacts are critical to address. And the big challenge, obviously, is that the evolution of AI is happening at a speed and scale that is so unprecedented, in a period where there is some regulatory pullback and worrying regulatory pullback and political pullback on, certainly on voluntary mechanisms, but on respect for human rights. And so the responsibility of the leading companies, and particularly the hyperscalers, we can't rely on voluntary mechanisms in the same way. I don't think we're going to see the same type of coalitions arising, but the advocacy, the policy advocacy that they must be doing, in addition to civil society organizations, to make sure that the UN guiding principles and other key corporate responsibility and environmental and social risks are addressed as strategically as possible in this very, very challenging time of hyperscalers. And at the same time, look at how AI can make a contribution to respecting human rights and human rights defenders.
Yeah, my final question, and this is about if you were to meet a young business leader or a CEO or somebody who's being recruited to join a board, what would be your 2 or 3 points of quick advice?
I think my main bit of advice was don't be a bystander, and that I think there is a fundamental values-based moral leadership challenge that every single person who has access to a reasonable education, access to any decision-making role needs to have right now. And I think, to me, it comes down to, first of all, engagement and listen and learn sometimes from the quietest voices, listen and learn from rights defenders, listen and learn from people or sources that you might not usually listen to. Secondly, think before you act, and i.e. due diligence. And even if there isn't a very structured due diligence process, the decisions you make, think, well, what is the impact they're going to have on people, be it on workers, on consumers, on communities? And then thirdly, be accountable. And first and foremost, be accountable to ourselves. But if you're in any decision-making role, and particularly if you're on an executive leadership team or at a board, put accountability mechanisms into place. And so I think that an engagement, due diligence, accountability are things that any leader right now should be doing first and foremost, in my view, for moral reasons and fundamental values, and that recognition that our duty as leaders is to treat people with respect, to respect human dignity, to do all we can to improve people's lives. And business can and must continue to be a force for doing that. But we can only do that with really, really rigorous engagement and listening and learning, with due diligence and with accountability.
Those are very wise words. Thank you so much, Jane. And thank you for all you do, and all the best in everything you do.
Thank you, Salil, and thanks very much to you and everyone at the Institute.
Thanks to my colleague Salil Tripathi. and to Jane Nelson for that important conversation to mark the 15th anniversary of the UNGPs. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you would never miss an episode. And if you'd like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.